New York City, 1928. The jazz age was roaring. Radios crackled with Duke Ellington. Speakeasies overflowed with laughter and gin, and families walked proudly beneath the bright lights of Broadway. America was speeding into modernity, unstoppable, alive. But on a quiet street in the Bronx, a young girl named Grace Budd buttoned her Sunday dress and kissed her mother goodbye, believing she was heading to a birthday party. She never came home. Imagine it, your daughter's hand slipping from yours, her small voice promising she'll be back before supper. Hours pass. Darkness falls. The supper table is set, but her chair is empty. And then, years later, a letter arrives. The handwriting is shaky, the tone almost polite. At first it seems like a cruel prank, but as you read, the words turn monstrous. Graphic descriptions of how your child's final hours ended, written by the man who took her. A confession not in a courtroom, but in your kitchen, delivered like poison on paper. This is the story of Albert Fish, a gray, frail man who looked like a harmless grandfather. But inside was something unspeakable. Hunger, ritual, and a cruelty so cold it outlived him. Over 12 chapters, we will descend into his mind, trace the hunt that finally exposed him, and hear the letter that still echoes as one of the most disturbing documents in American crime. New York, 1928. The city was electric. Neon signs hummed along Broadway, glowing pink and blue over crowds that never seemed to thin. Horns from yellow taxis tangled with the syncopated rhythms spilling out of Harlem clubs, where Duke Ellington's orchestra made nights feel endless. Newspapers called it the era of jazz, a decade when America seemed invincible. Prosperity was visible even in the worn bricks of tenement neighborhoods. Immigrants still tired from the voyage, but hopeful that their children would climb higher. This was a city in motion, confident and reckless. The Brooklyn Bridge was a cathedral of steel. Babe Ruth was hitting home runs that turned working men into believers. And in apartments all across the city, families tuned their radios to listen, together, to the future unfolding in sound. It was easy, in that noise and light, to believe the city had outgrown its shadows. Easy to forget that in the silence between speakeasies, crime bred in alleys. Easy to miss the lone figure walking among the crowds. A stooped man in a shabby gray suit, his hair thinning, his face forgettable. No one glanced twice. Why would they? He looked like someone's grandfather, perhaps a pensioner lost in thought. That man was Albert Fish. If you had seen him then, you might have stepped aside politely, maybe even offered him your seat on a trolley. You would not have known that beneath his coat, he carried scraps of paper filled with obsessions so grotesque they defy explanation. You would not have known he had already begun hunting, not for money, not for vengeance, but for something darker. In another part of the city, a young girl named Grace Budd was growing up in a poor but proud family. The Budds were hardworking, clinging to respectability in a world that often denied it to the working class. Grace was their hope, a bright-eyed child, gentle and trusting, who liked ribbons in her hair and songs on the radio. She was the promise of a better tomorrow. The irony of the jazz age is that while one half of New York lived in noise and brilliance, the other half lived in silence and hunger. And it was in that silence that predators moved most easily. Fish did not hunt in speakeasies or ballrooms. He lurked in doorways, classifieds, and cheap boarding houses, places where desperation lived. Imagine the contrast. Upstairs, families danced to phonographs. Downstairs, in dingy rented rooms, Fish scribbled notes about children, his fantasies disguised as scripture. Neighbors heard nothing. The city swallowed every sound. The summer of 1928 would bring their worlds together. The buds with their modest dreams, and Fish with his unholy appetite. The meeting would appear ordinary at first, the way evil often does. But before we arrive at the Buds' small apartment on East 15th Street, before the door opens to a stranger pretending kindness, let us linger in the broader city. For it is important to remember what New York was then, a monument to progress. Its tallest building, the Woolworth Building, pierced the sky like proof of American ambition. Radios crackled with the announcement of Amelia Earhart's daring flights. Newspapers promised miracles of science. Parents told their children the future was bright. And yet, what is progress worth if it cannot protect a child at a front door? What is modernity worth if a letter, sent through the very mail system that symbolized America's reach, becomes the weapon that will haunt a family forever? At the heart of this story lies one object. Not the knife, not the rope, but the letter. Written on cheap stationery, in spidery handwriting, by a man who knew that words could hurt more than any blade. It will arrive later in our tale, but already it hangs over every moment like a storm gathering on the horizon. The summer of jazz would play on. Trumpets blared, dancers twirled, and families laughed over Sunday dinners. No one suspected that in the quiet corners of the city, a predator was circling. No one knew that the letter had already begun to form in his mind, long before ink touched paper. And when it did, it would not only confess a crime, it would become the crime itself. On East 15th Street in Manhattan, just a few blocks from Union Square, stood a modest apartment building. Its bricks were soot-darkened, its windows often rattled with the noise of trolley cars. But to the Budd family, it was home. Delia Budd, the mother, was a woman hardened by circumstance, but not yet defeated by it. Her hands were roughened from washing and scrubbing, her face lined not with age but with endless worry. Her husband, Albert Budd, ironically sharing a name with the man who would one day destroy them, was a porter, earning little more than enough to keep food on the table. Together they lived by the working-class code of survival, thrift, prayer, and hope that their children would not suffer the same hardships. Among their 6 children, Grace stood out. She was 10 years old, with soft brown hair and a sweetness that seemed immune to the world's cruelties. Teachers spoke kindly of her. Neighbors admired her politeness. She had none of the roughness that life in tenements so often forced upon children. She was, in the eyes of her parents, the family's jewel, the one who might escape poverty's grip. The Budds had dreams, small ones by modern standards, but monumental for them. They dreamed of their children learning a trade, perhaps finding steady work in a shop or office. They dreamed of Sunday dinners where meat was not a rare luxury. And for Grace, they dreamed of marriage into a respectable family, a life far from the sweat and soot of Manhattan's poorer quarters. It was in this fragile hope that the door opened to Albert Fish. He came not as a monster, nor even as a stranger. He came cloaked in kindness. The Budds were introduced to him through their son, Edward, who at 18 wanted to find honest work. Like many young men, Edward looked for jobs through newspaper classifieds and word of mouth. One advertisement, allegedly seeking farmhands, led to a meeting with an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Frank Howard, a harmless, soft-spoken farmer from Farmingdale, New York. Frank Howard was, of course, Albert Fish. The disguise was perfect in its ordinariness. A gray mustache, a shabby but respectable suit, a voice tinged with the courtesy of another generation. He spoke of pigs and chickens, of green fields and fresh air. For a boy like Edward, the promise of farm work sounded like escape, freedom from the cramped streets of Manhattan. When Fish visited the Budd apartment, Delia welcomed him with cautious gratitude. Guests were rare, and rarer still those who offered opportunity. He praised the family's manners, complimented Grace's sweetness, and spoke warmly of country life. The Budds, unused to deceit on such a scale, saw only generosity. That afternoon, they believed fortune had finally smiled. A job for Edward, perhaps for his friend Willie, and, just maybe, a chance for Grace to spend a Sunday in the country. When Fish suggested taking Grace to his niece's birthday party before the boys began farm work, it seemed almost divine providence. Imagine Delia's relief. For once, the weight of worry seemed lighter. She could picture her daughter laughing among balloons, tasting cake, running across green grass far from the grime of Manhattan. The image was so pure, so hopeful, that she ignored the unease that flickered, however briefly, in her heart. After all, wasn't this the very dream of every immigrant parent? That a kind stranger might open a door their own hard work never could? Albert Fish understood this better than anyone. He was not simply deceiving the Budds, he was weaponizing their dreams. He knew that in poverty, hope itself can be a vulnerability. Grace, excited and trusting, prepared for her outing with the innocent joy of a child who has never known betrayal. She wore her best dress, tied a ribbon in her hair, and promised her mother she'd be back before evening. Delia kissed her daughter's forehead, reassured by the kindly figure who stood waiting at the door. The door closed. The supper table was set that night as it always was. Plates were laid out, bread placed in the center, broth simmering on the stove. But one chair remained empty. At first, the Budds reassured themselves. Children linger, parties run late, trains are delayed. Hours stretched into worry. Night fell. Edward and his father searched the streets, asking at stations, peering into the shadows. No one had seen Grace. Delia sat by the door, hands clenched in prayer. Each creak of the stairwell convincing her that Grace's footsteps were returning. But the door never opened. The Budds could not know it then, but their dream had been stolen the moment Albert Fish entered their home. They would not see Grace alive again. The cruelest detail is this. The Budds had placed their hope in the kindness of a stranger, and it was precisely that hope, the dream of something better, that Albert Fish devoured first. The newspapers would later call him the Gray Man. It was a fitting name. In the 1920s, New York City bustled with color, bright dresses, electric signs, the shine of automobiles. But Albert Fish seemed to drain every shade around him. He dressed in muted suits that had seen better decades, his hat brim low, his face forgettable. He walked with the slow shuffle of an aging pensioner, and he carried himself with a kind of weary dignity that made strangers polite, not suspicious. That was his camouflage. When he stepped into the Budd family's apartment and introduced himself as Frank Howard, he played the role with perfect precision. He was deferential, soft-spoken, and, most disarming of all, he seemed entirely harmless. Who would look at this thin, gray-haired man and think of violence? He looked like a man who might carry peppermints in his pocket, who might nod approvingly at children saying sir and ma'am. What no one saw was the private theater inside his mind. There, the role of kindly farmer was only a mask. Behind it, a darker script was playing out, one where children were not neighbors' sons and daughters, but symbols, obsessions, objects of desire and torment. The Budds saw none of this. They saw a man who spoke fondly of his farm in Farmingdale, Long Island. He described green pastures, fresh air, the kind of rural peace city families often dreamed about. He spoke of needing strong young men for farm work and promised Edward a good wage. His words were careful, deliberate, tuned to the family's desperation. Every syllable dripped with opportunity. Delia Budd's eyes softened as he spoke. Poverty leaves little room for skepticism when a promise of relief knocks on the door. It wasn't the first time Fish had played this role. Over the years, he had perfected the art of blending in. Boarding house keepers remembered him as quiet, almost invisible. Neighbors thought of him as eccentric, but harmless. He would sit on park benches reading newspapers, sometimes scribbling notes on scraps of paper. He kept lists of every state in the Union, alongside names of children and bizarre references to pain and penance. No one ever thought to peer over his shoulder, and when he did allow himself to speak of his past, it was usually with a touch of self-deprecating humor. He hinted at being a widower, a man unlucky in life but still pushing forward. He wore his loneliness like an old coat, threadbare but believable. The role was convincing because it was partly true. He was a father. He did have children of his own. He had once been married. But what he concealed was the darkness that had followed him through every chapter of his life. Whispers of cruelty, bizarre obsessions, the trail of abandoned homes and frightened neighbors. Sitting in the Budd's apartment that day, Fish's eyes moved from face to face. Edward, eager to prove himself. Willie, his friend, equally hopeful. And then Grace, 10 years old, radiant in her innocence. She listened politely, perhaps shyly, to the kindly old man describing farm chores and birthday parties. She was polite in the way children are when their parents encourage them to respect guests. And in that politeness, Albert Fish saw his opening. He returned days later, bearing small gifts of strawberries and cheese, tokens of generosity that reinforced his disguise. He assured the Budds that Edward and Willie would soon start work on his farm. But first, he said, there was the matter of a birthday party for his niece. Wouldn't Grace enjoy coming along? Just for the afternoon. Just a harmless outing. The suggestion slid into conversation like butter on warm bread. No alarm bells rang. Why should they? In the Bud's world, kindness was a rare commodity. To question it seemed almost ungrateful. Grace herself was delighted. The idea of a party, cake, laughter, it was a small thrill in a life of limited pleasures. She dressed with care, choosing her best white dress, tying a ribbon in her hair. Delia fussed over her, smoothing fabric, adjusting bows. The sight must have filled her with pride. Her daughter looked so proper, so beautiful. Surely this was the beginning of something better. Fish stood by the door, hat in hand, the very picture of a patient gentleman. He thanked the Budds for their trust, assured them Grace would be home by evening. His voice carried a sincerity that would have disarmed even the most cautious mother. When they left the apartment together, Grace skipping ahead, Fish shuffling behind, the neighbors likely noticed nothing unusual, just a grandfatherly man escorting a girl to a family gathering. But in Fish's mind, the party did not exist. There was no niece, no cake, no laughter. There was only the plan, refined through years of fantasy and fixation. Grace Budd was not a child to him. She was a vessel for appetites he could not explain, even to himself. The Budds watched from their window as Grace and the old man disappeared into the summer sunlight. They could not know that their daughter's life had already ended in that moment. Not in blood, but in trust. And in the days to come, that trust would become the very weapon Fish used to destroy them. Sunday, June 3rd, 1928. The day was warm, bright with the promise of summer. Families across New York dressed in their best, walking to church or gathering in crowded parks. For the Budds, it was meant to be a day of hope. A day when their daughter Grace would step, if only briefly, into a world of possibility. She wore her finest white dress. The fabric was thin but carefully pressed, and she tied a ribbon in her hair that fluttered with every movement. Grace was proud of her outfit. She wanted to look perfect for the party Frank Howard had promised. Her mother Delia adjusted the bow one last time, straightening it with the delicate pride that only a mother knows. At the door stood Fish, stooped, gray, and unassuming. He tipped his hat, thanked the Budds for their trust, and assured them Grace would be back by evening. His voice was soft, warm, and practiced. It was the sound of safety. Grace smiled, waved to her family, and stepped into the sunlight. It was the last time they would ever see her alive. They walked together, the old man and the young girl. Imagine the sight. A 10-year-old skipping lightly at the side of someone who looked like a grandfather. To passers-by, it was ordinary, even comforting. No one suspected that the kindly farmer was leading her not to cake and candles, but to something unthinkable. Grace must have felt a small thrill of adventure, leaving the cramped streets of her neighborhood, headed for what she thought was a joyful afternoon. Perhaps she imagined meeting new friends, tasting sweet frosting, carrying home a story to tell her brothers. She trusted him completely. Children are taught to respect their elders, and Fish, in his gray suit and hat, played the role flawlessly. But inside his mind, the script was different. For years, Fish had nurtured obsessions that blurred the line between punishment and desire. He filled notebooks with violent fantasies, convinced that pain was holy, that suffering was a form of redemption. He carried with him the tools of his rituals: small blades, scraps of cloth, twisted objects that had no place in a child's world. Every step he took with Grace brought those fantasies closer to reality. Meanwhile, back on East 15th Street, Delia set the supper table. The family spoke of the farm, of Edward's new job, of how Grace would enjoy herself. They allowed themselves the luxury of imagining a better future. For once, hope filled the cramped apartment like sunlight through a window. As afternoon turned to evening, Delia expected to hear Grace's footsteps on the stairs. The clock ticked, the stew simmered, but the door never opened. Night fell. Worry crept in like a draft. Albert Budd and Edward went searching, asking neighbors, checking stations. No one had seen Grace. Delia sat by the window, her hands tight in her lap, every sound in the stairwell making her heart leap. She told herself it was fine. Children lose track of time. Parties run late. But with each hour, the silence grew heavier. The kindly old man had vanished too. What happened to Grace that day is almost unspeakable. She was led not to a farm, not to a party, but to a small, empty house in Westchester County, an abandoned place Fish had scouted beforehand. Inside those walls, stripped of laughter and light, his obsessions were unleashed. The details of what followed were revealed only years later, and only through the letter that Fish himself would write. It was not a police report or a court testimony that painted the picture. It was his own words, carefully written, sent to the Budd family like a final act of cruelty. And it was in that letter that the world would learn the true nature of Albert Fish, the cannibal, the sadist, the man who turned a child's last Sunday into one of the darkest crimes in American history. But in 1928, the Budds knew none of this. All they knew was that their daughter was gone. The police were called. Posters were printed. Neighbors whispered. Detectives began their search, following a trail that seemed to vanish into thin air. What they didn't yet realize was that the man they sought was no ordinary criminal. He was a man who had spent decades perfecting his invisibility, hiding behind the image of frailty and kindness. He was a ghost in plain sight. For Delia Budd, that Sunday became a wound that would never heal. Every meal, every holiday, every family gathering afterward would carry the absence of Grace. The empty chair at the table became a monument, silent but undeniable. And in another room, somewhere in New York, Albert Fish sat quietly, folding away his disguise like an old coat, already planning his next move. By dawn the next morning, the Budd family's apartment on East 15th Street no longer felt like a home. The supper table from the night before still bore the marks of uneaten food, bowls crusted with broth gone cold. The chair meant for Grace remained empty, untouched. The silence in that room was louder than any noise outside. Albert Budd, the father, had aged years in a single night. His voice, once steady, cracked when he spoke to the police officers who came to take the report. Edward, who had been promised the farm job, blamed himself. If he had not answered the advertisement, if he had been more cautious, perhaps his sister would still be there. Delia sat rigid, her hands clenched white in her lap, as though sheer force of will might summon Grace back through the door. The police arrived promptly, but theirs was a process mired in routine. Missing children were not unusual in New York. In a city of millions, people disappeared every day. Runaways, accidents, kidnappings, each week brought dozens of new cases. But something about this one unsettled them. Perhaps it was the dignity of the Budd family, their insistence that Grace was no runaway. Perhaps it was the strange figure of Frank Howard, a man who had walked into their lives so suddenly, bearing promises that now felt like poison. Detectives fanned out across the city. They checked train stations, questioned neighbors, scanned boarding houses. They asked after a kindly farmer with gray hair and a stoop, but New York was filled with old men in shabby suits. The description was too ordinary, too vague. He vanished into the city's crowd like smoke. The Budds clung to hope. Each knock on the door might be Grace. Each phone call might be news. But as days turned to weeks, hope soured into dread. The press seized on the story. A young girl gone missing in broad daylight. It was a headline that sold papers. Journalists printed Grace's photograph, her white dress described in painful detail, her trusting nature memorialized in ink. Neighbors were interviewed, rumors spread. Some claimed to have seen her near Grand Central. Others swore she had been spotted in Brooklyn. Each lead was a dead end. Detectives considered the possibility of ransom, but no letter came. They considered the possibility of a runaway, but Grace was only 10 years old and had no reason to flee. The only clear thread was the man calling himself Frank Howard. Who was he? Where had he gone? The Budds described him again and again. Soft-spoken, gray, old-fashioned in his manners. A farmer, he said, from Farmingdale. He had written letters. Yes, they still had them. Edward produced the notes, filled with neat handwriting, promising employment. The police studied them. There was nothing overtly sinister in the words, but the careful phrasing, the slight oddities, made seasoned detectives uneasy. They sent officers to Farmingdale. There was no farm, no pigs, no chickens, no Frank Howard. The name was Smoke, and behind it, the figure of Albert Fish slipped further into shadow. Meanwhile, Fish watched. He read the papers, followed the story, savoring the attention while remaining invisible. For him, the hunt was part of the ritual. He had deceived not only the buds, but the entire city. Every false lead was a kind of victory. In his private writings, he scribbled phrases that mingled scripture with violence, fantasies with confessions. Pain, he believed, was holy. Suffering was purification. He saw himself as an instrument of something beyond human comprehension, a warped theology that gave his hunger the illusion of purpose. But the buds knew nothing of this. To them, he was still a ghost, a stranger whose real name they did not even know. As the weeks passed, the buds lived in a purgatory of waiting. Each morning, Delia opened the curtains, scanning the street below for her daughter. Each night, Albert sat by the door, listening for footsteps. Grace's siblings whispered her name at bedtime, unwilling to admit she might never return. The city, relentless as always, moved on. Jazz played, crowds danced, fortunes were made and lost. But inside that small apartment, time froze. The vanishing of one little girl had stopped the world for a single family. Detectives kept the case alive, but with no body, no ransom, no suspect, their work stalled. They began to file it among the city's unsolved mysteries, another name in a ledger of missing persons. But fate was not finished. For years, the buds would live in that twilight of uncertainty. And then, when time itself had dulled even the sharpest grief, an envelope would arrive. Thin, ordinary, bearing no threat from the outside. Inside, it would contain the most monstrous confession ever written. While the Bud family kept vigil at their door, detectives dug into the shadow left behind by the man calling himself Frank Howard. They knew little. An old man, frail, gray, who spoke of pigs and chickens in Farmingdale. No real farm, no Frank Howard. But even in 1928, lies left traces, and those traces began to lead backward. The handwriting on his letters was studied. The phrasing felt old-fashioned, tinged with biblical formality, as though the writer had stepped out of another century. Detectives carried the letters through precincts, asking if anyone recognized the style. Most shook their heads, but a handful muttered something darker. That sounds like Albert Fish. The name was unfamiliar to the buds. To police, it was not. Albert Fish had been drifting through New York for decades, a phantom leaving behind whispers. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, he carried with him a childhood marinated in tragedy. His father died when he was only 5. His mother, unable to care for him, placed him in an orphanage where punishment was constant. Beatings were routine, and pain was indistinguishable from attention. It was here, detectives would later learn, that Fish's obsessions began. Where other children cried under the rod, young Albert discovered something else. He liked it. Pain and affection fused in his mind. Discipline became desire. The orphanage closed its doors behind him years later, but its lessons never left. As an adult, Fish was unremarkable to those who met him briefly. A house painter, a handyman, a father of 6 children. He married once, only to be abandoned when his wife fled, horrified by the things she discovered. What exactly she saw has been left to speculation. Collections of strange objects, bizarre rituals, an appetite she could not understand. Neighbors recalled him as odd but harmless. He talked of religion, quoted scripture, and sometimes muttered about visions. He drifted from boarding house to boarding house, always carrying a satchel of papers. Landladies would later remember scraps of notes filled with cryptic phrases, confessions, names, fragments of his twisted theology. He was a man who blended in by virtue of being forgettable. And yet, everywhere he went, rumors followed. By the early 1920s, whispers hardened into darker tales. Children who crossed his path spoke of strange encounters, offers of candy, promises of work, invitations that felt uneasy even to the very young. Police reports emerged of assaults, near misses, children who escaped by chance. The victims were poor, their families hesitant to involve the law, but patterns began to appear. Detectives piecing together these scraps in 1928 realized something chilling. Grace Budd was not the first. She was part of a trail that stretched back years, perhaps decades. What set Albert Fish apart was not merely his cruelty, but his philosophy. He was not a man who killed in rage or for profit. He saw his actions as ritual, as destiny. Pain was a sacrament. Suffering was holy. In the scraps of writing later recovered, Fish described punishments with the reverence of a priest describing liturgy. This was no ordinary predator. This was a man who believed he was chosen for a purpose, though the purpose was madness. Detectives traced his name through old records. They found arrests for petty crimes, rumors of indecency, abandoned jobs. They found his children, bewildered, half estranged, who spoke of a father who forced them into strange fasts, who told stories of saints mutilating themselves for God, who carried switches in his pockets to beat himself until blood ran. Each piece painted the picture darker. The Budds, meanwhile, lived in torment. They clung to each knock at the door, each call from police. Rumors reached them that Grace might have been seen alive. Each time, hope sparked, and each time it died. They were never told the full extent of Fish's history. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps it was negligence. But in those early months, they did not yet understand that the man who had taken their daughter was not merely a liar or a kidnapper. He was something altogether worse. It is important to pause here, to recognize the irony. In 1928, New York was roaring with progress. Radios, telephones, automobiles, tools meant to shrink distances, to bring people closer, to catch criminals faster. Yet Albert Fish slipped through all of it. He had no car, no fortune, no allies. He had only his ordinariness and the shadows that the modern world still could not banish. Detectives suspected. They even whispered his name. But without a body, without proof, suspicion remained only that. And Fish, gray and frail, walked unnoticed through the city that hunted him. In his mind, however, the crime was not over. It was never simply about the act. For Fish, it was about the memory, the echo, the ritual that continued long after Grace had vanished. And in time, he would ensure the Budds shared in that ritual, not with rope or blade, but with words. The letter had not yet been written, but already, in the quiet corners of his boarding house, Fish was composing sentences, words that would outlast him, words that would wound more deeply than any knife. 6 years passed. From that Sunday in 1928, the Budd family had lived in a suspended world. Time moved forward for everyone else. The Jazz Age ended, the Great Depression crushed the city, and breadlines replaced speakeasies. But inside the Budd apartment, nothing truly changed. The chair at the table remained empty. The memory of Grace's white dress haunted every Sunday morning. The case was still open, but detectives had little more than ghosts. The name Frank Howard was worthless. Rumors came and went. Sightings of a girl resembling Grace, whispers she had been taken west, Even cruel suggestions, she had simply run away. Each rumor cut the buds deeper. Hope itself became a weapon against them. And then, one morning in November 1934, the mail arrived. It was an ordinary envelope, thin and white, addressed in shaky handwriting to Mr. and Mrs. Budd. Delia turned it over in her hands. There was no return address, only a faint postmark. She slid it open, expecting, perhaps foolishly, a new lead, maybe even some shred of closure. What she found instead was horror in words. The letter was written in cramped script, spidery and uneven. It began with a strange tale, almost a sermon, recounting a story from the past about a famine in China. The writer described, in grotesque detail, starving families who turned to cannibalism, how children were sold, butchered, and eaten. At first, it seemed like the ramblings of a madman, unrelated to Grace. But then, the letter turned. "I called on you," it read, "and your sweet little Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her." Delia's hands shook as she read. Her eyes moved across sentences that seared themselves into her memory forever. The writer described taking Grace to the empty house, how she had trusted him, how she believed she was at a party. He wrote of the moment he ended her life, and worse, what he did after. The words were clinical, calm, devoid of shame. He described cooking parts of her body, tasting them, savoring them. It was not only confession, it was performance. The man who had taken Grace had chosen to return not with ransom or plea, but with this: a letter designed to ensure the Buds suffered endlessly. The Buds collapsed. Delia fainted. Albert Sr. rushed to the police, letter in hand, his face pale with shock. Detectives who read it were stunned into silence. Even seasoned officers, men who had seen corpses pulled from rivers and butchered in alleys, found themselves shaken. The calmness of the writing, the coldness of the details, were unlike anything they had ever seen. It was not just what the letter described, but the way it was written. There was no urgency, no sense of guilt, only a kind of dreadful pride, as though the writer believed he was offering the family a gift of truth. The detectives realized instantly. This was no random crank. This was the man himself. The voice in the letter was too precise, too intimate. He knew things no outsider could know. They had, at last, a direct link to Grace Budd's killer. The letter was handed to the Missing Persons Bureau. Inspectors examined the stationery, the envelope, the writing. They noticed something. The envelope carried a small emblem on its flap. It was from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, a small drivers' union. Whoever wrote this had access to their stationery. Detective William King traced the paper back to a rooming house. A boarder had stolen a handful of the association's letterheads years before. The boarder's name? Albert Fish. The ghost finally had a name. As police closed in, Fish seemed almost to invite it. He had written the letter not to conceal, but to reveal. It was as if he wanted the world to know what he had done, to record his ritual in ink so it could not be forgotten. Whether it was arrogance, madness, or some mixture of both, his letter had achieved its purpose. For the Buds, it was the cruelest moment of all. The letter did not return their daughter, nor did it allow them peace. Instead, it gave them images they could never escape. Every word was a blade, but for detectives, it was the break they had prayed for since 1928. After years of chasing shadows, they had finally cornered their man. In the quiet of a boarding house room, Albert Fish sat alone, unaware that the letter, his proud confession, his ultimate cruelty, was also his undoing. Police would soon be at his door, but before that knock, before the man was led away in handcuffs, he sat in the fading light of his room, satisfied. He had written his scripture. He had carved his legacy in words. The buds would never be free of it. And perhaps, in his twisted mind, that was his final triumph. December 13th, 1934. The trail had gone cold for 6 long years. But now, thanks to a letter, his own words, his own pride, detectives knew the man behind Frank Howard. His real name was Albert Fish. Detective William F. King had been obsessed with the case. He carried Grace Budd's photograph in his pocket for years, a reminder of a promise he had made to her family, that he would not give up. The letter gave him the break he needed. The stationery traced to a boarding house on East 52nd Street, where the landlady remembered a strange old tenant who paid his rent on time, who muttered scripture under his breath, who seemed to live more in his own head than in the real world. King knocked on the door. The man who answered looked harmless, stooped, thin, his gray hair clinging in wisps. He wore a rumpled suit that might have been fashionable 30 years earlier. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, the eyes of someone who had spent too long staring at nothing. "Mr. Fish?" King asked. The old man nodded. It was almost too easy. There was no chase, no resistance. Fish did not slam the door or flee out a window. He simply stood there, blinking in the hallway light, as though he had been waiting for this moment. When King moved to handcuff him, Fish didn't flinch. He simply held out his wrists, thin as twigs, with the calmness of a man who had resigned himself to fate. At the station, detectives began their questioning. Fish spoke softly, with courtesy, as though he were still playing the role of a kindly old gentleman. But the mask slipped quickly. He admitted to knowing Grace Budd. He admitted to writing the letter. And then, in a voice steady and without shame, he began to describe what he had done. The detectives, hardened men who had seen bodies pulled from rivers and corpses sprawled in alleys, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The way Fish spoke was not frantic, not defensive. It was calm, precise. He detailed his rituals as though reciting recipes, his words slow and deliberate. He spoke of how he had led Grace away, how she had trusted him. He spoke of the empty house in Westchester. And then, with the same tone one might use to describe building a fire or preparing a meal, he recounted the acts that turned a missing child into one of the darkest crimes in American history. There was no pride in his voice, but no remorse either. Only inevitability. Detective King, listening, felt a chill that went beyond the facts. It was not only what Fish described, but how. The old man seemed detached, as though narrating the story of someone else. When pressed on why he had written the letter to the Budds, Fish tilted his head and said simply, "They deserve to know." King stared at him across the table, searching for some crack in the facade, some glimmer of guilt, some flicker of shame. He found none. The news spread quickly. The gray man arrested. Confession in Grace Budd case. The city, still staggering under the weight of the Depression, found itself transfixed by the story of a frail old man who concealed a darkness more terrifying than gangsters or bank robbers. Neighbors came forward. They spoke of strange behaviors, Fish inserting needles into his own flesh, speaking of visions, quoting scripture at odd hours. Landladies recalled the smell of raw meat, the scraps of paper with bizarre writings. Former acquaintances described a man whose oddities had always seemed eccentric, never dangerous. Now, those oddities looked like warnings no one had heeded. In his cell, Fish remained calm. He asked for little. He prayed often. At times, he muttered to himself, a litany of scripture spliced with fragments of his own warped theology. To guards, he seemed more like a frail grandfather than a killer. That, perhaps, was the most disturbing part of all. The newspapers dubbed him the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria. Reporters dug into his past, unearthing a life littered with cruelty, abandonment, and obsession. He had been married, fathered 6 children, lived in dozens of boarding houses. He had worked menial jobs, blended into crowds, walked unnoticed among millions. And all the while, he carried his rituals with him like a second skin. When the Buds learned of his arrest, the moment was bittersweet. They had a name now, a face. The ghost that had haunted their lives finally stood in chains. But it did not bring Grace back, and it did not erase the words of the letter, which replayed in their minds every night. Albert Fish had been revealed, but the true horror was only beginning to surface. Once Albert Fish's name hit the newspapers, whispers turned into testimony. Families came forward. Children who had once encountered a frail old man with peppermints in his pocket recalled how something about him had felt wrong. Others had darker stories, sons and daughters who never came home. The Buds had thought they were alone in their nightmare. They weren't. Detectives began connecting dots across years, even decades. Cases long buried in dusty files suddenly came alive again. There was Francis McDonnell, a 9-year-old boy from Staten Island, found murdered in the woods in 1924. Witnesses remembered seeing him walk with a gray-haired man, stooped and shuffling. The boy's mother said she had seen the man herself, lingering outside their home days earlier, muttering to himself. At the time, police had no suspect. Now, the description fit Albert Fish perfectly. Then there was Billy Gaffney, a 4-year-old who vanished in 1927. He had been playing with another child in Brooklyn when he disappeared. The surviving child told police that the boogeyman took him, a tall story, easily dismissed at the time. But years later, when Fish was questioned, he admitted to taking Billy. He described the child's terror, his screams echoing down hallways, and with the same chilling calm, he described what he had done afterward. The boogeyman, it seemed, had been real. Each new revelation deepened the horror. Fish was not a one-time killer. He was a serial predator who had drifted through the city for decades, preying on the most vulnerable. Poor families, immigrant neighborhoods, children who would not be missed by powerful institutions. All had been part of his silent hunting ground. Detectives pored over unsolved cases, missing children, unidentified remains, bodies left in empty lots. They began to suspect that the full scope of Fish's crimes might never be known. The city was too large, the records too scattered, the years too many. Fish himself only added to the uncertainty. Sometimes he confessed freely, savoring the attention. Other times he denied, laughed, or fell silent. His words were like smoke, appearing, twisting, then vanishing. He admitted to some murders, hinted at others, and invented still more. Sorting truth from madness became nearly impossible. For the Buds, each revelation was another blow. It meant their daughter was not the sole victim of a lone madman, but one among many in a pattern stretching back years. Grace's fate was unique in its cruelty, but not in its selection. She had been chosen not for who she was, but for what she represented. Innocence, trust, vulnerability. And now, other families began to feel the weight the Buds had carried. Mothers who had clung to the hope their sons had run away. Fathers who had told themselves their children had been lost to accidents. Now they faced the possibility that Albert Fish had walked into their lives too. The courtroom would eventually center on Grace Budd. Her case was the one with proof, with the letter, with a body that tied directly to Fish. But in the public imagination, the trial was haunted by a chorus of other voices, children whose names appeared only briefly in newsprint before fading back into shadows. Detective William King struggled with the enormity of it. Catching Fish had been his mission for 6 years, but he had never imagined this scope. He had told the Budds he would bring them closure. Now he realized closure was a lie. How could there be closure when the man before him admitted to horrors that defied comprehension, that multiplied with every interview? At night, King found himself replaying the testimonies of surviving children, the fragments of memory they offered. A kind old man offering candy, a gray suit disappearing down an alley, a voice quoting scripture, calm and steady. It was the ordinariness that haunted him. Fish had not lurked in shadows like a monster from folklore. He had walked openly, a ghost in plain sight, unremarkable enough to vanish in a crowd. And perhaps that was the most terrifying lesson of all. The newspapers, feeding on public horror, coined new names. The Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Gray Man. Each title tried to capture the unthinkable, to make sense of a predator who defied explanation. But no headline could truly contain the reality, because Albert Fish was not a werewolf, not a vampire, not even a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man, a father, a neighbor, a figure so ordinary he could pass through the streets unnoticed. And if such a man could carry within him such cruelty, what did that say about the world itself? In the Budd household, the letter was folded and locked away, too terrible to burn, too sacred to destroy. It sat like a curse in a drawer, while the family prayed for strength. Each night, they spoke Grace's name softly, as if keeping her memory alive could push back the darkness the Gray Man had left behind. But Fish had ensured they would never escape him. His voice lived in their minds, his words carved into their thoughts. And as detectives prepared the case for trial, they knew it would not be enough to prove Albert Fish guilty. They would have to prove he was human at all. Detective William King had spent years chasing shadows. Now, with Albert Fish in custody, his task shifted. Turn whispers into proof, madness into evidence. The trial ahead would not be simple. Fish was an old man, frail, almost skeletal, his skin drawn tight against his bones. He looked like someone's grandfather, harmless to the point of pity. A jury would have to see past the disguise. They would have to believe that this trembling, polite figure was capable of the acts described in that letter. So King returned to the beginning. The letter itself, the thin stationery, stolen years before from a chauffeurs' association, had been the loose thread that unraveled Fish's invisibility. King presented it like a weapon in court preparation. Every loop of ink, every jagged word, proof not only of authorship, but of intent. Forensic handwriting experts matched the spidery scrawl to notes found in Fish's boarding house. There was no doubt. The Budds had prayed never to see the letter again. But in order to convict Fish, its contents would be read aloud. Each line would become evidence, each word a nail in the coffin. Meanwhile, King and his fellow investigators traced Fish's movements across the city. Boarding house landladies remembered him well, punctual with rent, polite but odd. He muttered scripture, carried scraps of paper, and sometimes disappeared for days without explanation. One recalled hearing muffled cries through the walls. Another swore he smelled burning flesh late at night. The fragments painted a mosaic of horror. But in court, only what could be proven would matter. Rumors would not convict Albert Fish. Facts would. Detectives focused on Grace Budd. They reconstructed the day. Fish's visits to the Budd home, his promise of a farm job, the final Sunday when Grace put on her best white dress. Witnesses confirmed seeing her leave with him. The trail led to the abandoned house in Westchester, where neighbors recalled a stooped old man renting it briefly before disappearing. That house became the silent witness to Grace's fate. Its empty rooms, its dust, its broken boards, all testifying to what had happened behind closed doors. Fish himself was maddening. In interrogation, he spoke freely, but not consistently. Some days he denied killing Grace. Other days he described it in detail. He admitted to the letter, but then claimed parts were exaggerated. His words shifted like sand, leaving detectives with the impossible task of separating confession from delusion. And yet, in his calm tone, in the precise details he occasionally revealed, there was truth. Truth so cold, it left even seasoned officers shaken. When asked why he had targeted Grace, Fish leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "She came willingly," he said, as though that erased everything. Detective King clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to strike the old man, to erase that smile. Instead, he took notes. The only weapon against Albert Fish was the truth, delivered in a courtroom where lies would not survive. By early 1935, the case was ready. Fish would be charged with the murder of Grace Budd. Other suspected victims, Francis McDonnell, Billy Gaffney, would remain in the shadows, haunting but unproven. Grace's case alone had the evidence, the confession, the letter. The Budds prepared themselves for the ordeal. They would have to hear the letter again, every word read aloud before strangers. They would have to sit in the same room as the man who had destroyed them, watch him speak, listen to his voice. It was a cruelty almost equal to the crime itself, but they came anyway, not for vengeance, for grace. As the trial approached, newspapers swarmed. Headlines screamed, "Cannibal killer caught." "The gray man to face justice." Reporters painted Fish as something between monster and ghost, his name now infamous across America. Some articles leaned on lurid details, others on pity, describing him as senile, harmless. The public was divided. Was he a predator beyond reason, or a madman unfit for the electric chair? Detective King knew the jury would wrestle with the same question. It wasn't enough to prove Fish guilty. They had to prove he was sane enough to be guilty. Otherwise, he might escape execution under the guise of insanity. And so, the hunt narrowed to its final question. Was Albert Fish evil, or simply mad? In the days before trial, Fish sat in his cell, calm as ever. He prayed aloud, whispered fragments of scripture, and sometimes laughed quietly to himself. Guards reported seeing him insert needles into his skin, remnants of rituals he had practiced for years. Doctors examined him and found dozens of them buried deep in his flesh, rusting in silence. To the Budds, to King, to the entire city, it no longer mattered whether Fish was mad or sane. He was something else altogether, something words struggled to contain. But in court, words would decide his fate. The trial of Albert Fish opened in March 1935 at the Westchester County Courthouse in White Plains, New York. It was a modest courtroom, but once the gray man was led inside, it became a stage where America's fascination and horror converged. The defendant shuffled in, thin as a scarecrow, his suit hanging off his frame like rags on a wire. At 65, he looked more like a pensioner awaiting charity than the accused murderer of a 10-year-old girl. Some spectators whispered pity, others felt only revulsion, but everyone stared. The Budd family sat quietly in the gallery. Delia clutched her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. Albert Sr. stared straight ahead, refusing to glance at the man who had taken their daughter. They had come not for spectacle, but for justice. Grace's empty chair at home demanded it. The prosecution opened with precision. They laid out the facts. Grace Budd, last seen with Fish in June 1928. The false identity of Frank Howard. The abandoned house in Westchester. And then, the letter. A hush fell as it was read aloud. Each word, written in Fish's spidery hand, filled the room with a silence heavier than chains. Mothers in the gallery wept openly. Jurors shifted in their seats, pale and stricken. Reporters scribbled furiously, some stopping mid-sentence as their stomachs turned. Delia Budd closed her eyes. She had sworn not to cry, but the words tore through her resolve. They were not just evidence. They were wounds reopened, made public, forced upon her again. When the reading ended, the air in the courtroom felt poisoned. The jury had heard not simply of murder, but of something beyond it. Acts so grotesque they defied language. The defense did not deny Fish's actions. Instead, they pleaded insanity. They painted him as a man consumed by delusion, a victim of lifelong madness. They spoke of his childhood in the orphanage, where beatings turned to twisted pleasures. They described his self-punishments, the needles driven into his own flesh, the fasts and flagellations he called religious penance. Doctors testified. Some declared him insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Others insisted he knew exactly what he was doing, that his elaborate deceptions, his careful planning, his cruel letter proved intent. The courtroom became a battleground, not over what Albert Fish had done, but over what he was. A lunatic or a monster? Fish himself took the stand. His voice was soft, steady, almost polite. He answered questions with calm precision, recounting details of his life with unsettling detachment. At times, he quoted scripture. At times, he smiled faintly, as though amused by the fuss surrounding him. When asked why he killed Grace, he offered no remorse. "She never suffered," he said. "I made sure of that." The words chilled the room. They were a lie, of course. The letter had told another story. But the way he said it, soft, gentle, reassuring, was almost worse than the truth. It was the same tone he had used to win Grace's trust. The kindly old man, hiding the wolf within. Jurors stared at him, trying to reconcile the frail figure with the horrors they had heard. Was he insane, or was he simply evil? Did it matter? The prosecution hammered at one point again and again. Fish knew what he was doing. He lied about his name. He planned the trip to the Budd house. He lured Grace with a story. He rented the Westchester house ahead of time. He concealed himself for 6 years. These were not the acts of a man who could not tell right from wrong. These were the acts of a predator. And then there was the letter. If Fish were insane, why write it? Why describe in such careful detail what he had done? Why send it to the Budds, unless he understood the depth of cruelty it would cause? The letter became the prosecution's most powerful weapon, proof not only of guilt, but of deliberate malice. For 11 days, the trial seesawed between horror and disbelief. Reporters described spectators fainting, jurors trembling. Even the judge looked stricken. The phrase, "beyond words," appeared in more than one article. But in that courtroom, words mattered. Words would decide whether Albert Fish walked into an asylum or into the death house at Sing Sing. When closing arguments ended, the jury retired. They took less than an hour. The verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: death by electric chair. The Budd family sat in silence as the decision was read. There were no cheers, no sighs of relief, only exhaustion. Justice, such as it was, had been delivered. But it did not erase Grace's absence. It did not silence the words of the letter. Albert Fish nodded faintly as the sentence was pronounced. There was no outburst, no plea. He accepted it with the same calm with which he had described his crimes. As deputies led him away, he shuffled like an old man leaving a church service, his head bowed, lips moving in quiet prayer. January 16th, 1936. Sing Sing Prison. The gray man shuffled one last time. Guards guided him down the narrow hall, the last mile, as inmates called it. He wore a simple suit, pressed for the occasion, his hair combed flat. To look at him, one might have mistaken him for a grandfather on his way to Sunday service, but the men escorting him knew otherwise. They had read the letter. The chamber waited, humming with the electric promise of justice. The chair itself was wooden, scarred from years of use, its straps worn smooth by the passage of men who came before. Fish lowered himself into it without resistance, his thin frame almost disappearing against the wood. Witnesses reported his calm. No pleas, no cries, only a faint nod, as if this too was ritual, as if the pain to come was simply another penance. The switch was thrown. Light flickered. The old man convulsed, once, twice, and then was still. The gray man was gone. Back in Manhattan, the Budd home remained what it had always been. Modest, quiet, worn by time. The supper table was set each evening, as it had been on that Sunday in 1928, and still, one chair sat empty. Justice had been carried out, yet the letter remained. Folded, hidden away, but never gone. Its words lived on in the minds of the Budds and in the history of American crime. Not just a confession, but a curse. A reminder that evil does not always come with claws or fangs. Sometimes it comes in gray suits, with kind words and a smile that asks for your trust. The letter had ended with calm finality, but its echo never faded. And even now, if you listen closely, it asks a question no jury can answer. What is more terrifying, that Albert Fish was a monster, or that he was only a man?